Hello, scholars. This is Mr. Myers doing lesson 4.10, The Problems of Local Government and Participation. As always, please take good structured notes over our objectives. Today, we're focusing on issues and problems involving local government and participation with four key areas: duplication of services, crime police reform, education, and then a general overview of problems with local participation. Okay, let's jump in. So the first thing that you should note that makes St. Louis really different than other, metropolitan areas is that St. Louis County has over 90 different municipalities within it, over 90 different cities within the county. Within that, there are 22 different school districts, 43 different fire departments, and 67 different police departments. So one of the obvious questions to ask is, well, why is this the case? Well, part of it is because it's relatively easy to incorporate or to create a municipality in the St. Louis County Charter. So over time, especially from the 1950s onward, it certainly accelerated. This process of fragmenting services, of creating these smaller municipalities and duplicating these services has accelerated over time. And the size of those municipalities varies wildly. There is a police department for a municipality called Country Club Hills, and the population of Country Club Hills is only about 1,000 people. And then you have the city of Chesterfield, which has 47,000 people that has its own police force. Now, I know I framed this as a problem, so let's start by just addressing the fact that there are definitely benefits of having, your own little cities and your own little municipalities carved out of the counties. And one of those advantages is that you have more local services, right? In Clayton, we have a Clayton Fire Department and a Clayton Police Department. And in theory, the Clayton Fire Department and Clayton Police Department would provide superior service to the people of Clayton because they know the community, they know the community's needs and interests, and are better able to provide more specialized services, right? And that would be kind of true across the board. The downside, though, is that you have a lot of duplication of efforts. You have fragmentation of services. Every one of these police departments has a police chief. Every one of these school districts has a superintendent. Every one of these fire departments has a fire chief. When Dr. Glossinger came to Clayton from Nashville, one of the things that he noted when we taught government together was just how crazy this system is. In Nashville, there is one police department, there is one school district, there is one fire department. And Nashville, of course, is a metropolitan area relatively, similar to the size of St. Louis. And so you need to think about the advantages and the disadvantages, the cost-benefit analysis of having municipalities this small. I don't know if the image on the right is big enough for you to find Clayton, but a quick little Google search for St. Louis municipalities will pull this up, and you can do a little bit of digging and see for yourself the Country Club Hills of St. Louis that you never knew about. Another problem related to local government are issues related to crime and safety and police reform. Most of you have probably heard of the murder rates in St. Louis being on the high end, and that's certainly true. Here it says that the St. Louis metropolitan area has about the fourth highest murder rate in the country, based on cities, again, of our size. But there are also, smaller issues that really bother, city residents, right? Traffic violations. There are people driving around with temporary tags all the time. They don't register their cars because the fines are so small that it's easier for people just to, drive their cars illegally without registering them than it is to actually get it done. People running red lights and speeding. So everything from murder rates down to, traffic enforcement are issues in St. Louis. There's also very recently been a major backlog at the district attorney's office, which basically means that there's not enough lawyers to, handle the casework. And if you're poor and you can't afford to get out of jail on bail, this means that you're waiting longer and longer and longer in jail for your trial. And of course, you're innocent until proven guilty. So this is another issue. Hopefully this will be addressed relatively soon. There's been some shakeup at the district attorney's office, so hopefully that backlog will get addressed. And then, of course, there's the memories of Ferguson, right? The Michael Brown shooting and the riots that happened in the wake of that. The Department of Justice came in and investigated the situation in Ferguson after the riots, and their report was shocking and damning. You can see this one little statistic right here, that in Ferguson, with a population of 21,000 people, 16,000 of the 21,000 had some kind of outstanding warrant in 2014. That gives you some kind of sense of the abuse that was happening within this municipality. So related to the first slide that we talked about with all these different municipalities, one of the ways that they generate revenue is by issuing traffic tickets. And so many of these places become predatory, right? They prey on people driving through these tiny little municipalities. The speed limits change on you very quickly, and when you are getting a huge amount of your municipality's revenue through traffic violations, it leads to, it opens the door for major abuse. And of course, that's what was happening in Ferguson. You can pause and just read a little bit of the highlights from the Ferguson report here, and I think you'll agree we had some problems here and still do. A third area to talk about would be education. One of the major problems with education is the inequities tied to funding. Because so much of school districts are funded through property values, there are huge discrepancies from one neighborhood to another. In Clayton, the average home price is well north of $800,000 or $900,000. That's going to be generating an enormous amount of revenue to fund those schools. But there are places like Riverview Gardens where the housing values are a fraction of what's in Clayton, and they have so much less. You can see the graphic on the right. You can see Clayton's spending per pupil is at the top, and Riverview Gardens is at the bottom there. You can take a look at that discrepancy and ask yourself, is that fair? Is how good of an education you get, should it solely be determined on the zip code in which you're born or you happen to live? So some people think the government should play more of a role in education, at the very least in terms of funding and developing some kind of equitable formula for funding. But we can also ask ourselves, should the government be putting more funding into public schools? If they're broken, should they be putting more emphasis on providing alternatives for people who want to leave the public school system and go to something like a charter school? And then if we put more money and efforts into providing alternatives like charter schools, do you continue a brain drain and a funding drain that just simply makes the public system worse, and those that are left behind and can't leave are even in a worse situation? So, to what degree do we try to fix the public system or provide alternatives is a real question. And lastly, let's talk a little bit about just participation in local government. The first point says, what are strategies to increase low voter turnout, especially for local races? When you only have 10 to 20% of registered voters coming out for these local elections, and the local government has a disproportionate impact on people's lives, how do we, get the word out and increase participation in these local elections that really matter? Now, in a previous lesson, we also talked about the Missouri plan for selecting judges, which is this great nonpartisan plan, and you are just simply voting to retain or not retain the judge. Well, I'll be the first to admit, I'm a government teacher, I'm a relatively educated person who keeps up with the news, and even I, when I go in to vote, don't necessarily know how to vote on these judges. And so, if someone who is educated, a teacher, a government teacher who is paying attention to the news, and they're not really sure about these Missouri judges. Now, of course, the Bar Association puts out information, and you can look up information about each of the judges in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. They put a voter guide out there, but I think the average voter really doesn't know much about these Missouri judges. So that's a criticism of the nonpartisan court plan. And then lastly, how should we organize local government to make it both as effective as possible and as efficient as possible? These two things kind of seem to be at odds with each other. Local government provides superior services in theory because it knows the people better and the community better and the community's needs, and it is more directly physically proximate to it. But having those duplication of services means that we're not being very efficient with our money, and we have duplication of services. Okay, well, this ends our 40th lesson on government at Clayton High School. I hope you took good notes and bring any questions to class. Later.